One of the first questions people ask me when they get to know me a little better is, how did you know when you wanted to be a writer? And I find that to be a really interesting question because it's like, if I were a software engineer, they wouldn't have asked me, when did you know you wanted to be a software engineer? There's some kind of nobility about being a writer, something that's romantic in essence. I always answer with, I always knew, because it's just what was. I was born a writer because I was born with this ability to think in a certain way. And that certain way is through words. I've always been a wordsmith, but up here, there's always been some kind of dialogue going on. And I think that's what makes a really good writer, is the ability to observe and interact with the world, but to also label things with words. Now, with the English language, things get really interesting. We almost have a language that we're making up on the fly, which is why it was always easy for me to find a word or an idea for an emotion that I was feeling or for something that I didn't understand that I was seeing. And since I grew up in New York City, in Manhattan, and specifically in Hell's Kitchen, there was always something to see and there was always somebody to talk to about something. I grew up reading books constantly. I grew up reading the labels on anything that I found. Anything I could get my hands on that had words on it, I was reading it. So I was always a word-based person. It wasn't until I got to elementary school, first grade or so, where I started to realize that it was pretty easy for me to just put words in my head on paper. And funny enough, I actually had a huge problem with writing at first because the mechanics of it were something that were too slow for my brain. My brain was always moving very quickly, but my motor skills weren't able to match that pace. I always knew that I was good at writing and my teachers always acknowledged that. But funny enough, they kind of dissuaded me from it because I wasn't so physically good at doing it. But anyway, when I got to middle school, I started to realize like I have a gift. I'm pretty good with words and I have good reading comprehension. I can understand the books that are given to me and I can write pretty well about them. When I got to high school is when I realized that I could make a career out of it. I was one of the ones who, because I love books, I wanted to be an English major. I didn't really care what I would do for a career. I just knew that it would have to involve literature. Writing itself and the art of it wasn't really clicking with me yet until my college counselor told me that I should look into journalism. I had always been a big sports guy, like sports broadcasting and sports journalism. I always read Sports Illustrated as a kid. I loved ESPN shows like Around the Horn, The Le Batard Show, Pardon the Interruption. So the journalism was always within range, but it wasn't until I realized that the words in my head and my ability to see the world and put words to those things was effectively journalism. Once that clicked, I dropped the whole English lit. I realized that words could be used to communicate real world ideas to other people. And specifically when it came to news, it gave me a new angle of how I could attack problems and issues and ultimately use it for social justice. So when I got to college and I started taking my journalism courses, I fell in love because it's such a virtue-based profession. And that's a lot of what you learn about in class. In journalism class, of course, you're learning about the inverted pyramid, how to write a proper story with proper accreditation, how to quote somebody, like all the technical stuff. You learn all of that. But the biggest things that stood out and the things that they've had entire classes on is being a good journalist. That doesn't just mean a good writer or somebody who can report very quickly. Being a good journalist was something of a badge of honor. It's something that you had to earn, and it's something that you almost had to be born with. You had to have these virtues instilled in you as a young person, or there were some things that you had to learn as you developed your career. When I realized this, it was something that I went all in on because it just kind of meant being a good person in service for others, which is something that I really value to this day. I went to a Jesuit high school, and the Jesuits are a version of Catholics who are more service-based. They have a lot of history to them. You should look them up. They're kind of interesting. But they're mostly service-based, and my school's motto was men for others. It taught us to be of service to other people, to make sacrifices on behalf of the greater good. And that's something that totally aligned with journalism. So it only made sense when it started to become easy for me to report things, and it became easy for me to form relationships with people because I had good intentions. And my writing was really authentic, and it came across as virtuous because it was. But it wasn't all easy. At first, I had some issues communicating with people and trying to figure out how I would shape stories. And if you're being an honest journalist, sometimes you're missing pieces from a story that you can't just fill in. And when I didn't have the right pieces for my story, it felt like a personal shortcoming. Like I wasn't good enough, or I messed up, or I should have asked this question. This was in my very young career, and that's something that I've learned to overcome. But at first, it felt pretty challenging. It was like, man, how am I going to be a journalist if on the spot, I can't get all the good questions out. I'm not able to get a person in the right frame to answer certain questions or to give me the story that I want. But these are things that you overcome as you progress in your career. And so I went from being a college journalist, working with the newspaper and whatnot, to working with a sports magazine and an entertainment magazine, writing at least 6 articles a day. That's how I started off my professional career, was writing a ton of articles. And I'm grateful for it because it got my writing to a really strong point. But it also shows you that this is not easy stuff. It is point blank a lot of writing. It's a lot of work, a lot of editing, staring at a screen, trying to figure out the right word, trying to see if your ideas are conveyed correctly, and also doing it within time. There are deadlines in journalism, and if you don't meet them, you didn't meet them. There are no exceptions, and you don't want to be the guy who misses on a deadline. So that sense of deliverance and consistency was instilled over the years. But it wasn't until I got to NBC right after college where I realized just how real it is in the news world. News is extremely fast-paced, and it's fully dependent on what the audience or the world believes and feels at the moment. One thing could be the biggest story on earth, and then the next minute, that could be an entirely irrelevant story because the next biggest story is now superseding that one. This is where I learned grit as a journalist. I learned a lot of my skills in journalism school, but once you get into the field and get your hands dirty, you see how real it is. I learned how to cold call. I learned how to track down sources. I learned how to bother somebody until they gave me the quote that I needed. I learned the art of persuasion, having people share pictures and videos that they initially didn't want to, but for the sake of the news, they were willing to share after speaking with me. I learned how to deal with colleagues, coworkers, middle management, the corporate overlords. You know, working at a place at NBC, it's no small world. You see how real it gets in terms of corporate interests and how stories should be shaped to fit that corporation's narrative. Now, this isn't some big conspiracy reveal. It's just the way it is. News is a business, and I simply learned the business side of that. Working at NBC and CNBC for a few years was an incredible experience. I met so many great people and so many helpful people. Many of those people have gotten me to the place where I'm at now, and I have to give them their flowers for that because without them, I wouldn't be here. At these companies, although I was very young, I learned that the most important thing is for people to know who you are. If you do good work, people will recognize you, but if you really want somebody to remember you, you have to become friends with them. You have to provide for them in a way that's like an emotional support. You want to be able to be there for them, and you want to show up when it's important. There's nothing more valuable than that. From a networking perspective, you're now one of the first people they think of when they think of an opportunity. From a mentoring perspective, it was equally as important. Having guidance and curation in your career is so important, especially as a journalist, because it's a pretty broad field that if you lose your direction, you might get lost. I always had good people around me who treated me with respect and dignity and valued my skills and valued my experience, even though I didn't have very much of it. I think they generally saw potential in me and allowed me the freedom to be creative and experimental in a field where that's not always welcome. Bounced around in a few places after that, starting with then newsletter company Morning Brew, which was another great place to work and is doing awesome work now. Ventured into making content for ad agencies and health food companies, and now I'm here wrapping all of it together into my own news company where I hope to share some of the elements of what I've learned throughout the years. It's an awesome place to be because although my career has spanned over 7 years now, it feels like I'm in a place where it's just starting. This is the infancy of what I believe is to be a media empire.